Welcome to the Unique History channel. Today we'll be doing a reading from Communism, A History by Richard Pipes, Part 1, Communism, Theory and Program. So let's jump in. The idea of a classless, fully egalitarian society first emerged in classical Greece. Ancient Greece happened to have been the first country in the world to recognize private property in land and to treat land as a commodity, and hence it was the first to confront the social inequalities that result from ownership. Hesiod, a contemporary of Homer, in the poem Works and Days, extolled the mythical golden age where people were not driven by the shameful lust for gain, when there was abundance of good for all to share and mankind lived in perpetual peace. The theme of the golden age resounded in the writings of the Roman poets Virgil and Ovid. Ovid spoke of the time when the world knew nothing of boundary posts and fence. The idea acquired its earliest theoretical formulation in the writings of Plato in the Republic. Speaking through Socrates, Plato saw the root of discord and wars in belongings. Such differences commonly originate in a disagreement about the use of terms mine and not mine, his and not his. And it is not the best ordered state in which the greatest number of persons apply the terms mine and not mine in the same way to do the same thing. In the Laws, Plato envisioned not only a society in which people shared all worldly possessions, as well as their wives and children, but with Aristotle, Plato's pupil questioned whether such a communist utopia would bring about social peace on the grounds that people who hold things in common are more prone to quarrel over those who hold them in private ownership. Furthermore, he argued the root of social discord lies not in material belongings, but the yearning for them. It is not possession, but desires of mankind which require to be equalized. There exists a widespread fake notion that socialism and communism are merely up-to-date secular versions of Christianity. As the 19th century Russian philosopher Vladimir Soliev has pointed out, the difference is that whereas Jesus urged his followers to give up their own possessions, the socialists and communists want to give away the possessions of others. Moreover, Jesus never insisted on penury. He merely consulted as the easy way to the salvation. St. Paul's well-known saying about money is usually misquoted, saying, "He said not that money is the root of all evil, but that love of money," in other words, greed. St. Augustine asked rhetorically, "Is gold not good?" And he answered, "Yes, it is good, but the use good for gold of evil, and the good use for good gold for good." The fathers of the church and later Catholic theologians took a pragmatic view of ownership. According to St. Augustine, a propertyless world was possible only in a paradise of the golden age in which mankind had lost because of the original sin. Given human imperfection, property is moral if used wisely and employed for charitable purposes. The Catholic Church not only did not preach property, but disowned sometimes and persecuted those who did. The founders of Protestantism, notably Calvin, viewed wealth as a positive and good sign of divine grace, but the notion of the Golden Age never disappeared from European consciousness. In the early maritime explorers ventured on their journeys, inspired not merely by the quest for El Dorado and other mystical places in which gold was reported to be as plentiful as dust, but also by the desire to find the islands of terrestrial paradise, legends of which circulated in medieval Europe, and when they first landed in the Americas and saw naked Indians, they were convinced they had found them. For it was not lack of shame, but the very mark of the life before fall. If the natives indeed lived in paradise, this meant that they knew nothing of property. Columbus, on his return, reported that the aborigines were guiltless and never refused anything which they possessed if to be asked of them. On the contrary, they invite anyone to share it. He was uncertain, or whether or not they knew private property, but noted in which one had all took a share, especially of edible things. These naive first impressions soon yielded to more realistic appraisals of American Indians, but not before giving rise to a utopian literature that since become a permanent feature of Western thought. Thomas More's Archetypal Utopia, described in the book that of the name he published in 1516, was, some scholars believe, inspired by the travel accounts of Columbus and other early explorers. Far from the place that the modern age usage of adjective utopian conveys, it was Austrian regimented community where all citizens dressed alike and lived in identical houses, where no one could travel without permission, and where private discussion of public affairs carried the death penalty. Money was abolished, gold and silver to make chamber pots. The common theme of Sequensis Utopian was in More's both the absence of private wealth and the coercion of individuals by the community at large. Utopia, both in theory and practice, signifies the individual's subservience to authority, which compels him to do what he is disinclined to do of his own free will. It needs to be stated at this point the ideal of a populous golden age is a myth, the fruit of longing rather than the memory, because historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists concur that there was never a time or a place where all productive assets were collectively owned. All living creatures, from the most primitive to the most advanced, in order to survive, must enjoy assured access to food and secure access to claim ownership of territory. During the eons before humans settled down to pursue agriculture, when they lived primarily by hunting and gathering, kinship groups asserted exclusive access to their area, expelling or killing trespassers. Property claims intensified after transition to agriculture some 10,000 years ago, because cultivation of the soil is androgynous work and its fruits take time to mature. In the oldest civilization, dating back 5,000 years, Pharaonic Egypt and Mesopotamia, agricultural land belonged to palaces and temples. Ancient Israel is the first country where we possess evidence of the private land ownership. The Lord in the Hebrew Bible casts a curse on anyone who tampers with boundary stones. And several biblical books tell families as well as individuals holding land and pasture in private possession. But land ownership in ancient Israel was hedged by many religious and clan restrictions. It is in classical Greece that from the earliest times agricultural land was privately held. In other words, there is no evidence at the time, even in the most remote past, there existed societies that knew no boundary posts and fences or ignored mine and thine. A critical contribution to the socialist and communist theory was the conception of human nature formulated by the thinkers of the Enlightenment. Traditionally, human beings were believed in the West to be made of the body and soul, both given their shape by the Creator, and the soul was viewed as filled with ideals and values implanted at birth. This was a conservative notion, since it postulated the immutability of human nature, and such as it would always be. In other words, if man was acquisitive he would remain. And the premise was challenged by the first English philosopher, John Locke, in his Essays Concerning Human Understanding, 1690, denied the existence of innate ideas. According to him, at birth, the mind or soul is a clean state. All ideas and values derive from sensory experience. This theory implies that human nature is malleable rather than consent, and hence that people can be shaped in such a manner that their natural goodnesses, which philosophies took for granted, would overprevail their selfishness. The French 18th century thinker Claude Adrien Helvetius, I can't pronounce that, made the implicit explicit, arguing that the proper instruction and legislation would not only enable but compel humans to attain a complete virtue. This highly questionable psychological theory became the common heritage of liberalism, socialism, and communism, in which varying degrees rely on instruction or coercion to achieve their respective objectives. In some respects, the communist state established by Lenin in Russia in November 1917 was a grandiose experiment in public education undertaken on the Helvetus model on creating an entirely new type of human being, one rid of vices, including acquisitiveness. It was the French radical thinkers of the 18th century who first advanced communist programs calling for the abolition of private wealth on the grounds that it was the cause of every misery known to mankind. In the words of Morley, the author of the influential L'École de la Nature, in 1755, published in 1755, the only vice I know in the universe is avarice, and all the others, whatever names one gives them, are merely forms, degrees of it. Analyze vanity, conceit, pride, ambition, deceitfulness, hypocrisy, villainy, break down the majority of our sophisticated virtue selves. They all dissolve into subtle and pernicious element, the desire to possess. Such economically and determined psychology lies at the root of every socialist and communist doctrine. Prior to the middle of the 19th century, the ideal of equality was an aspiration that occasionally produced social violence, both lacked by a theory and a strategy. Thus, in 17th century England, Gerard Winstanley, the leader of a radical group called the Diggers, exhorted his followers to seize the commons and turn them into arable land. He formulated something like a communistic doctrine that denounced commerce in its land or its product. During the French Revolution, a century and a half later, the French radical François-Noël Babeuf organized a conspiracy for equality, which called for the socialization of all property. Neither man, however, had a doctrine capable of demonstrating how the kind of social revolution he advocated would come into being. The same held true for socialist idealists active in the early 19th century, such as Comte de Saint-Simon and Charles Fourier, who pinned their hopes on persuading the rich to part with their wealth. From time to time, there emerged in the West voluntarily communist societies. One of them was the Virginia Company in Jamestown, 1607, and another, New Harmony of Indiana, founded in 1825 by British philanthropist Robert Owen. All attempts broke down sooner or later, largely because their inability to solve the problem of free riders, members who drew a full share of the community's harvest while doing little, if any, work. The contribution of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to socialism was a theory that purported to show why the kingdom of equality was not only desirable and feasible, but inevitable. To advance this claim, they resorted to methods borrowed from the natural sciences, which they had gained immense prestige in the 19th century. Marx and Engels formulated a doctrine of scientific socialism, which asserted the ideal of a populist, egalitarian society was something not only that should happen, but by virtue of natural evolution of the economy, had to happen. The Marxist concept of socialist evolution arose under the influence of the Darwinian Theory, formulated in 1859 on the origin of species. Darwin's book depicted the emergence of biological species as due to a process of natural selection that enabled them to survive in a hostile environment. This process was a dynamic one, evolving species from a lower to a higher stages according to determined rules. This theory was quickly adopted by students of human behavior, giving rise to evolutionary sociology that depicted history as a progression by stages from lower to higher events. So Darwin's influence on Marx, that Engels, speaking at his funeral, says, just as Darwin has discovered that the law of development of organic nature, so did Marx discover the law of human history. The injection of evolutionary thinking into socialist theory introduced into the element of inviolability. According to scientific socialism, human actions may somewhat retard or accelerate social evolution, but they cannot alter its direction, which depends on objective factors. Thus, for reasons that will be spelled out below, capitalism in time must inexorably yield to socialism. The emotional appeal of this belief is not much different from the religious faith in the will of God, inspiring those who hold it with the unshakable conviction that no matter how many setbacks their cause may suffer, ultimate victory is assured. It would hold a special attraction for intellectuals by promising to replace spontaneous and messy life with a rational order, which they would be the interpreters and mentors. As Marx put it in a celebrated dictum, philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change that. And who is better qualified to change it intelligently than intellectuals. For all its formal commitment to the scientific method, Marxism violated its basic feature, namely open-mindedness and a willingness to adjust theory to new evidence. Bertrand Russell called Bolshevism, an offspring of Marxism, a religion that spoke of its habit of militant certainty, but about objectivity, doubtful matters. It was a rigid doctrine, dismissive of different views. Marx made no secret of his attitude towards those who disagreed with him. Criticism, he once wrote, is not a scalpel, but a weapon. Is objective, is the enemy. It wishes not to refute, but to destroy. Marxism was thus a dogma masquerading as a science. Marx's Marxism's adaptation to the scientific culture was only one factor for its appeal. The other had to do with concurrent changes in social condition. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the basis of the world's economy had been agriculture. Until then, up to 80 to 90% of Europeans and Americans lived on and off the land. The rich derived their wealth from the land and the rents it brought. Trade and manufacture, of course, had existed since the remotest antiquity, but they played a marginal role in the economy. Land was the principal source of wealth, and for which reasons egalitarian movements concentrated on abolishing private ownership of it. The emergence of large-scale mechanical manufacture changed that. Money from industry and commerce gradually replaced income from rents as the main source of wealth. It also created a new form of poverty, for mechanization lowered dramatically production costs as traditional forms of small-scale manual production became obsolete and many artisans were thrown out of work. Industrialization not only caused painful social dislocations, but fundamentally and permanently altered relations between employers and employees. Landlords and their tenants had been neighbors and in some respect partners. Although the occasional tenants suffered mass expulsions during the Enclosure Acts in England and by the large countryside which was stable, in such countries as the United States where the great majority of farmers owned the soil they cultivated. In industrial societies, the relationship of owner to employee turned tenuous and volatile, as the former felt free to dismiss workers whenever demand grew slack. Differences in lifestyle became more glaring as the nouveau riches flaunted their wealth. These developments led to a growing hostility to capitalism. Socialism until then was the ideal with particular appeal to intellectuals, now acquired in addition to theoretical foundation. A social base among certain segments of the working class. The collected works of Marx and Engels filled dozens of volumes. Das Kapital alone covers more than 1,400 pages of dense technical prose. Few people have ever plowed through this difficult literature, and hence one may wonder how to explain its immense influence. The answer is that the basic tenets of the doctrine of scientific socialism can be reduced to several rather simple propositions. In his address at Marx's funeral, Engels described the law of human history his friend is said to have discovered. That mankind must first of all eat, drink, and have shelter and clothing before it pursues politics, science, art, and religion. That therefore the production of the immediate material means of substance forms the foundation upon which the state institutions, the legal conceptions, art, and even the ideas of religion on people concerned have most evolved. In the light of which they must be explained instead of vice versa, as well as hitherto been the cause. In short, economics is the foundation of all organized life. All else is a superstructure. From this premise, Marx and Engels proceeded to formulate a theory of social evolution, the central postulate of which holds that control of means of production to emerge of the social classes. Originally, there was no private property in these means. All land was held in common. But in time, the primitive communal order gave way to class differentiation as one group succeeded in monopolizing the vital resources and used its economic power to exploit and dominate the rest of the population by erecting political and legal institutions, protecting its class interests. It also employed culture, religion, ethics, and the arts and literature to the same end. Such devices have enabled the ruling class to exploit the rest of the population. Of course, the lower classes do not acquiesce peacefully to their exploitation. They resist, and although as long there is private property, they merely succeed in replacing one form of exploitation with another. For this reason, in the words of the Communist Manifesto, so far all the histories of society has been a history of class struggles. Such reflections on the past served Marx merely as a prelude to his main interest on the analysis of contemporary capitalist world. He spent many years poring over the evidence on the English economic history in order to demonstrate that capitalism was the final stage of class society and that it was bound to collapse as a result of revolution of exploited industrial labor. That the revolution would last, for it would inaugurate the reign of a classless society. At this point, history would come to a full stop. The capitalist system results on exploitation of wage labor in that the capitalist appropriates the surplus value of what the worker produces. According to Engels, the notion of surplus value was the second great idea that Marx had contributed to human understanding. All value derives from labor. Under the capitalist system, however, the employer pays his workers only a fraction of the value that they create, just enough to keep them alive. The excess or surplus he pockets. In the evolution of the capitalist mode of production, both the rate and profit obtained by the capitalists and the wages of the workers steadily decline. This happens because, confronting fierce competition, the capitalist has to spend ever more of his capital on equipment, raw materials, and the like, and ever less on wages, which are some of the source of his profits. Labor becomes cheaper and wages decline, leading to a steady drop in living standards. At the same time, in the course of crisis that appears periodically because of overproduction, large enterprises swallow up smaller ones, and industrial wealth is concentrated into fewer hands. Thus, the capitalist and the worker find themselves in the same boat. As it were, the former affected by the crises of the exploitation and those richer than he, and the latter the victim of progressive pauperization. In the same time, the situation inexorably leads to revolution. Along with the constantly diminishing number of managements of capital, grows the massive misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, and exploitation. But with this, too, grows the revolt of the working class, a class that has ever increasing numbers and disciplined, united, organized by the very mechanism of capitalist production itself. The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production. Centralization of the means of production and socialization of labor at last reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist entombment. Thus, the entombment is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are the expropriated. Reforms of the capitalist system cannot prevent this outcome. It is inevitable. The ultimate result of the socialist revolution will be the total liberation of man. By freedom, Marx and Engels did not mean the liberal notion of civil rights and protection from the state. Political liberty is a sham liberty. Engels wrote, and the words possible slavery, the appearance of liberty, and therefore the reality of the servitude. Along with Engels, Marx rejected liberal freedoms and civil rights as fraud because they enslaved man to material things. Genuine liberty will be free beings from subjugation to them. What they had in mind was explained by Marxist theorist George Lucas. The freedom of man who are alive now is the freedom of the individuals isolated by the fact that property, which both reifies itself reified, is a vis-a-vis the other individuals, a freedom of the egotist and a man who cuts himself off from others. For this reason, the abolition of property is a prerequisite to genuine freedom. Only after mankind has been liberated from this dependency, it will attain a complete self-fulfillment, division of labor, the bane of humanity will be abolished, and other people will be free at will to shift from one occupation to another. Marx mused, in a communist society where no one has one exclusive sphere of activity, society regulates the general production, and thus it makes possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning for fish, rear cattle in the evening, and criticize after dinner. Just as I have in mind without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, or shepherd or critic. The theories formulated by Marx and Engels providing the program of the International Working Men's Association, properly known as the First International, which they founded in London in 1864 to prepare labor for the approaching crisis of capitalism. The organization from the first riven up disputes between socialists and anarchists. Although anarchists shared with socialists the common goal of classless and stateless society, as well as the means to an end violent revolution, in three respects they parted ways with them. The anarchists saw potential not in the industrial working class, but in the landless peasantry and the unemployed. The anarchists envisioned between collapsing capitalism and triumphing communism as a transitional stage, something called Dictatorship of the Proletariat, during which the new ruling class would use concentrated powers of the state to dispose the bourgeoisie of its capital and nationalize productive assets. The anarchists rejected the state in all forms, predicting that the proletarian dictatorship would turn into a new instrument of oppression, this time run for the benefit of intellectuals. While the Marxists relied on a natural progression of the capitalist economy to bring on a revolution, the anarchists called for direct action, that is, immediate assault on the existing system. Time proved the anarchists right on all three of these points. Social revolutions broke out not in industrial countries, but in agricultural ones, and the dictator proletariat did turn the communist state into a permanent dictatorship of non-workers over manual laborers and peasants. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 in Russia was also the result of a direct assault on the government where capitalism was still in its early phase of development. Thus, virtually every one of Marx's predictions turned out to be wrong and became increasingly apparent during his lifetime and incontrovertibly so after his death. While capitalism did indeed experience periodic crises, it never suffered a fatal crisis ending in societal breakdown, due partly to antitrust legislation, partly to the advances of technology, which opened ever new opportunities for the small entrepreneurs, and partly to the steady growth of the service sector at the expense of manufacture, and the consolidation of businesses did not progress to the point where all that remained were giant monopolies. The creation of a joint stock companies helped diffuse wealth, nor did labor suffer pauperization. Even while Marx was working on Das Kapital, evidence emerged that wages of labor in England were rising, evidence Marx chose to ignore. More important still was the introduction of state-sponsored welfare schemes. The industrial democracies, alarmed by socialist strides in organizing labor and gaining seats in parliament, instituted social legislation in the form of unemployment and health insurance and other benefits that helped keep the working class from sinking into destitution. The first country to take this route was Germany, where the Social Democratic Party was strong and seemed poised to gain a parliamentary majority. As other continental countries followed suit, workers acquired stake in status quo, turning a deaf ear to socialist calls for revolution. Their behavior contradicted the assertion of the Communist Manifesto that working men have no country. They had ceased to be a proletariat in the sense of the word, that is, a class whose only service to the state is consisted of breeding children, proles. Accordingly, they preferred the trade union activity, which accepted capitalist order and concentrated on obtaining greater share of capitalism's profits. They thus became the very part of the very system the Marxists wanted to overthrow. For all those reasons, no exploitation happened in any of the advanced capitalist countries. Such revolutions did take place in a century following Marx's death occurred, as the anarchists predicted, in the so-called Third World countries with embryonic capitalist economies, large landless or land-poor peasantries, and lawless regimes. The flaws in the Marxist doctrine would not have mattered much if it had not been a strictly theoretical construct, but it had since was a program of action as well, once its predictions proved false, and this became evidently shortly after Marx's death in 1883. First the Socialists, then the Communists, even while claiming orthodoxy, began to revise Marx's theory. In the Western democracies, these revisions generally softened Marx's revolutionary zeal and moved socialism closer to liberalism. The result was social democracy. In Eastern Europe and countries of the Third World, by contrast, the revisions tended to exacerbate the elements of violence. The result was communism. Marxism, in its unadulterated form, was nowhere adopted as a political platform because it flew in the face of reality. The First International broke up in 1876 but revived in 1889 after Marx's death. Known as the Second International, it united socialist parties of various countries, minus the anarchists whom it excluded, but in its mainstay was the German Social Democratic Party. Revolutionary in its slogans, evolutionary in practice, the Second International dominated socialist politics until the outbreak of the First World War. Its official program, the so-called IFRIT program, adopted in 1891, contended that the interests of the bourgeois state and the working class were irreconcilable, and that accordingly workers had no stake in their nation. They owed loyalty only to their class. It reaffirmed the international unity of labor and the imminence of a revolution that would crush capitalism and the bourgeoisie around the globe. Not all socialists accepted this radical doctrine. In countries of Europe, some insisted, realistically speaking, the progress of the working class would more likely come from a political and economic reform rather than violent revolution. The French socialist Jean Jaurès predicted, "The proletariat will come to power not through an unanticipated blow of political agitation, but by the methodical and legal organization of its own powers under democratic conditions and the universal right to vote. Our society will gradually develop towards communism, not through the collapse of the capitalist bourgeoisie, but a gradual and inexorable strengthening of the proletariat." The leader of this course was the English Fabian Society, which counted amongst its members such as literary luminaries as George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells. Its program called for persuading the country to emancipate itself from capitalism by nationalizing industry. Like the pre-Marxist socialists, and the Fabians appealed to the nation's conscience. The most audacious assault on the premises and agenda of Marxism was undertaken by Edward Bernstein, the leading light of the German social democracy and the founder of the socialist revisionism. Bernstein had spent many years in England, where he came into contact with Fabians. In the late 1890s, he appealed to the social democrats to adjust their theory as well as their program, the fact that capitalism was not about to collapse but was sinking to destitution. He continued to believe in socialism, but like Jaurès, thought it would come as a result of peaceful political and social progress within capitalism. He foresaw something like a convergence of capitalism and socialism, with the latter emerging from the former. The German Social Democratic Party, Europe's largest and most influential, rejected Bernstein's revisionist theories and continued to adhere to the revolutionary IFRIT program. In this practice, however, it did not exactly what Bernstein advocated, that is, emphasize trade unionism and electoral politics. It formally abandoned Marxism only in 1959. Thus, European socialism during its heyday, the quarter century was preceding the outbreak of World War I, moved in fact, if not always in theory, away from the violent revolution towards peaceful reform. Steady belief in labor's transnational solidarity, the Second International clung to the belief that workers of all countries were brothers and that they had supreme responsibility to prevent the wars unleashed by capitalism. The subject also came up for discussion at the Congress of the International. Various proposals were advanced on how to prevent a war and what to do in case, nevertheless, one broke out. The resolution adopted at the Stuttgart Congress of 1907, in drafting which participated two leading Russian Marxists, Vladimir Lenin and L. Martov, pledged in the case of war to rout the masses and thereby hasten the downfall of the capitalist class rule. In other words, to transform a war between nations into a civil war between classes. At the next Congress held in 1910, the delegates unanimously approved a resolution that called on socialist parliamentarians to vote against war credits. Unfortunately for them, the Socialists and the International had proved utterly powerless to prevent the general European war that erupted in the summer of 1914. Talk of a general strike led nowhere. To make matters worse, both German Social Democrats and French Socialists, contrary to their solemn pledges, voted for war credits, thereby completely discrediting the notion of the international worker solidarity. National loyalties came over class loyalties, a fact not lost on ambitious demagogues like Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, who had risen to power after the war on platforms fused with socialism and nationalism. The failure of the Second International to make good its anti-war vows dealt a devastating blow to its fortunes. Socialist parties survived after the war, but they became increasingly identified with their own nations. The cause of Socialism International now shifted outside of Europe, first to Russia and then to other non-Western countries. Okay, that's it. Thank you.